Imagine for a moment that you are living in a world long before smartphones, airplanes, or even the internet. A time when the only way to travel was by boat or horseback, and the most powerful empire in the world lay in the vast lands of the East. This is not just any empire, but China, a civilization that has stood for thousands of years, its history stretching back to ancient times. Now, in the early 1800s, you are in Canton Harbor, the heart of China's trade with the world. The air is heavy with the salty scent of the sea, mixed with the spices of the bustling market. The cries of merchants, the clang of metal, and the creak of wooden ships fill the atmosphere, painting a picture of a vibrant and prosperous city. You are far from home, a foreigner, but you found yourself in this thriving port city, surrounded by the people of the greatest empire on earth. From your vantage point, you can see the ships arriving and unloading treasures from every corner of the globe. Silk, porcelain, tea, luxuries the West can only dream of. You've heard stories of the great wealth China holds. It is said that China produces 1/3 of the world's goods, an empire so powerful that its emperor seems to need nothing from the outside world. For centuries, China has stood as the dominant force, culturally, economically, and militarily. But here you are, on the edge of this grand empire, watching the foreign trade unfold before your eyes. In the year 1800, China is, in many ways, the center of the world. Its people are proud of their history and their accomplishments. Silk, porcelain, and tea have become synonymous with luxury, and the Chinese emperor rules over a land of unmatched beauty and opulence. The imperial court in Beijing oversees a vast, sprawling kingdom that stretches from the mountains of the Himalayas in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. The emperor's mandate of heaven was said to justify his rule, his reign divinely ordained, his government untouchable. Foreigners from Europe, the Americas, and beyond are desperate to gain access to Chinese goods, but they are met with disdain. They can only trade in one small port, Canton, and are strictly controlled by Chinese officials. The emperor sees no need for the goods or knowledge these foreign nations bring. To the Chinese emperor, these foreign nations are nothing more than barbarians nations, with little to offer in comparison to the wealth and culture of China. The emperor's message is clear: China does not need you. As you stand in the busy marketplace of Canton, you can sense the arrogance and pride that permeates the very fabric of this ancient civilization. China has long been the center of trade, the heart of cultural exchange, and the source of wealth and luxury. In every corner, you can see symbols of its glory: fine silk, exquisite porcelain, and fragrant teas being exchanged between Chinese merchants and the few foreigners allowed to participate in this one-sided trade. The European merchants, desperate for access to Chinese goods, bring silver in exchange. But the Chinese people do not seem interested in anything the West has to offer. They do not need your technological marvels or new inventions, for they have already invented most of what is necessary for a thriving civilization. But as you observe the bustling harbor and the exchange of goods, a quiet storm begins to stir. What if, instead of foreign armies and weapons, the catalyst for China's collapse came from a far more unlikely source? A simple plant. A plant that grows in the ground, almost unnoticed by the world. A flower with a sweet, intoxicating fragrance. Its sap able to create a substance so powerful it could bring down the Qing Dynasty, the greatest empire the world had ever known. That plant was opium. For centuries, opium had been known in China, where it was used in small quantities for medicinal purposes, as a painkiller or to treat illnesses. Its properties were understood, but its use was carefully controlled and mostly confined to medical settings. However, as you walk the bustling streets of Canton, you begin to notice something unsettling. Foreign traders, primarily the British, are beginning to offer opium in exchange for silver. At first, It seems like just another commodity. But soon it becomes clear that opium is different. It is not just a product, it is a drug. And it is taking root in the very heart of Chinese society. Now, you are standing at the crossroads of history. China's prosperity is being chipped away, not by military invasion or foreign weapons, but by a drug. As the foreign merchants, eager to make a profit, continue to bring in opium to exchange for silver, you see the effects ripple through the city. The once proud, self-sufficient people of China begin to lose their hold on the prosperity that once defined them. It starts slowly, imperceptibly at first. A few addicts here and there, quietly consuming the substance in the back alleys and tea houses. The addicted population begins to grow, and the effects of this new trade begin to change the very fabric of Chinese society. The trade of opium, once a hidden and secretive operation, becomes a profitable venture, a thriving market that the British and other foreign traders take full advantage of. The Chinese government, initially hesitant to act, finds itself facing an insidious new threat. Opium is now being consumed not just by the wealthy elite, but by ordinary people, from merchants to laborers. The addiction spreads across social classes, and what was once a commodity of the elite has become a national crisis. As you wander through the streets of Canton, you begin to notice the signs of decay. Where once the city was bustling with energy and wealth, now there is a growing sense of desperation. The addiction to opium has crept into the lives of ordinary people, those who once produced the goods that made China the greatest empire in the world. Men and women alike now seek comfort in the drug, losing themselves in its powerful effects. They smoke it in the opium dens, where the air is thick with the sweet, acrid smoke, and the faces of the addicted are vacant, their bodies slumped in languid stupors. In these dens, the opium trade flourishes, and the very soul of China begins to rot. You can see it in the faces of the people. They are no longer the proud, hard-working citizens of the Middle Kingdom. Instead, they are now slaves to addiction, their lives slipping away piece by piece as the once great empire crumbles under the weight of this silent enemy. The great silk trade that once brought immense wealth to China is now overshadowed by the flood of opium flowing into the country. The Chinese government, in its desperate attempt to preserve the empire, begins to turn a blind eye to the growing problem, unwilling or unable to confront the foreign traders and their lucrative drug trade. The foreign merchants, sensing an opportunity for profit, continue to flood China with opium, and as the trade grows, so does the addiction. The silver that once flowed into China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain is now flowing out, draining the country's wealth as opium becomes the new currency of exchange. The Chinese emperor, who once saw his empire as the greatest on earth, now finds his people enslaved to a foreign drug. The world he once ruled is no longer his, and the Qing Dynasty, which has stood for centuries, is slowly, almost imperceptibly, being undermined. And so, the empire begins to fracture. From the opium dens of Canton to the highest courts of the emperor, the damage is done. China, once the most powerful and prosperous nation in the world, is now slipping away not by the sword, but by a flower. The wealth and power that once made China the envy of the world are now being siphoned away by the very drug that was meant to be an insignificant part of trade. The opium trade, hidden in plain sight, becomes the silent destroyer of an empire. Standing in the heart of Canton, you can see this transformation taking place. You watch as the ships come in, unloading their precious cargo, and you feel a growing sense of unease. The once untouchable empire, proud and powerful, is now vulnerable, not to military conquest, but to a drug that has become a tool of exploitation. You realize that you are witnessing the beginning of the end for China's greatest empire. It is no longer the uncontested superpower it once was, and its collapse, though invisible to many at the time, is already underway. The streets of Canton are alive with the sounds of merchants, but there is an undercurrent of despair that begins to spread. The foreign traders have found a way to weaken the Chinese without firing a single shot. Opium has become the new currency of power, and China's once mighty empire is slipping through its fingers as its people lose themselves in the haze of addiction. What started as a trickle and unnoticed problem has now become a tsunami, and the empire's collapse is no longer a matter of if, but when. The Qing Dynasty is, in many ways, already a shell of its former self, held together by the traditions of the past, but unraveling in the face of a modern world that China cannot control. The foreign merchants, having turned China's greatest weakness into a profitable trade, will soon find themselves at the center of a larger conflict, one that will forever alter the fate of China and the world. But for now, you stand there, a silent witness to history, watching as the greatest empire the world has ever known is brought to its knees, not by the might of foreign armies, but by the insidious power of a simple plant, its fragrance sweet and deadly. How did it happen? How did the most powerful empire on earth, one that ruled with absolute authority and pride, fall not because of foreign armies or the threat of war, but because of a single plant? This is the story of how opium, a seemingly innocent and insignificant flower, changed the course of history and brought the Qing Dynasty to its knees. A flower that began as a mere curiosity to the foreign merchants of the West, but would eventually plant the seeds of destruction for an empire that had stood for over 2,000 years. But before we go further, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself as one of the people who lived through this dramatic time. You are not a king, not a merchant, not a powerful official. You are simply an ordinary person, caught up in the events that unfold. The air is thick with the sounds of the marketplace. The city of Canton, where you live, is full of life. The ships are unloading goods from every part of the world. The smell of spices, salt, and smoke fills the air. And for now, life seems stable, prosperous, and eternal. But something is beginning to change, something silent but powerful, something you may not even realize at first. The opium trade, though still small, is growing. At first, it is only a luxury for the rich. But soon, it begins to creep into the lives of more and more people, consuming their lives, their families, their futures. As you lie down at night, the faint smell of opium wafts through the air, and you cannot help but wonder how long before China, with all its riches, all its history, all its glory, becomes a shadow of its former self. Now, I want you to imagine you are about to hear the story. You're lying in your bed, the world outside your window quieting as the night deepens. Take a deep breath, relax, and let yourself drift into the past. I'm about to tell you a story about an empire, a flower, and how one addiction led to the fall of China's greatest empire. It's a long tale, one that stretches over decades, and it may be hard to believe, but I want you to listen closely, for this is the story of how opium changed the world. As you get comfortable and allow yourself to settle in for the night, let this story take you on a journey. Don't worry about anything else for now. Let your mind wander back in time, to a time of trade, intrigue, and unseen forces that would shape the world in ways few could ever imagine. Tonight, you will fall asleep with the history of China's greatest empire in your thoughts. And as you drift off into the peaceful quiet of sleep, know that this is only the beginning of a tale that will echo for centuries to come. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the story unfold. Imagine a time when China, the world's most powerful and prosperous empire, stood at the pinnacle of global influence. The year is 1800, and you are in Canton, the single port where foreigners are allowed to trade. The harbor is alive with activity. Ships from distant lands unload their cargo, bringing treasures from all over the world: tea, silk, porcelain, all highly coveted by European nations desperate to possess the luxurious products only China could offer. For centuries, China had stood as the economic, cultural, and political center of the world, a civilization that had flourished in isolation, confident in its superiority. You stand in the bustling streets of Canton, the city's vibrant energy palpable in the air. The smells of salt water, spices, and human activity swirl around you as the clamor of merchants and porters fills your ears. Ships, large and small, are docked along the waterfront, their sails flapping in the wind, as crew members unload boxes of tea and porcelain, their goods sought after by the most powerful and wealthy nations of Europe. To the untrained eye, this could be any busy port in the world. But to those who understand, this is Canton, the beating heart of China's global economic supremacy. In this year, China produces more than a third of everything made on the entire planet, a staggering number that demonstrates the sheer scale of its dominance. As you look out over the harbor, you are struck by the thought that, for centuries, China has remained in control of its destiny. It is a civilization that has existed for over 2,000 years, and through most of that time, it has been the world's most powerful empire. The Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, rules over an empire that stretches across vast lands from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the borders of Central Asia in the west, from Siberia in the north to the jungles of Southeast Asia in the south. In every direction, China's influence is overwhelming, but the world outside China's walls is beginning to change. In Europe, nations are starting to expand beyond their borders. Powerful maritime nations like Britain, Spain, and Portugal are exploring the world, driven by a desire for wealth, trade, and territory. The European nations have begun to carve out their empires, establishing colonies in distant lands, yet they are still largely in awe of the Middle Kingdom, as China has long called itself. For centuries, China's imperial government has viewed itself as the center of civilization, a belief reinforced by its long history of accomplishments. The Chinese emperor, seen as the Son of Heaven, rules with divine authority over the Middle Kingdom, a term that reflects China's view of its central place in the world. In the early 1800s, the Western world, particularly Europe, is deeply fascinated by China's rich culture and luxurious goods. The Chinese, however, are indifferent to foreign influences. In fact, they view the Western world with disdain. To the Chinese emperor, European nations are merely barbarian states with little to offer. They have no idea of the Industrial Revolution taking place in Europe, nor of the rapid advances in technology, science, and military power that would soon transform the world. To the emperor, these foreign nations are not worth considering, as China has already perfected everything that is truly valuable. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, silk, all of these are Chinese inventions. What more could these barbarians have to offer? From the perspective of China's imperial court, the West's offerings such as woolen cloth, glass, and trinkets are of little use. The emperor, in his great wisdom, sees no need for any of these things. And so, in the early 1800s, China is firmly closed off from the rest of the world. The foreigners can only trade at Canton, the one port city where they are allowed access to the riches of China. However, even in Canton, they are treated with condescension and disdain. They are allowed to live in foreign-controlled quarters called factories, which are essentially designated trading posts, and they are strictly forbidden from learning the Chinese language, traveling freely within the country, or engaging in any meaningful interaction with the local population. The emperor's attitude is clear. The Chinese empire is self-sufficient, self-reliant, and does not need to engage with the outside world. In Canton, the foreign traders who are desperate to gain access to China's treasures find themselves caught in an intricate web of rules and restrictions. The Chinese merchants, known as the Hong merchants, control access to the goods that the foreign traders so desperately want. These merchants are immensely wealthy, with fortunes that could rival the richest men in Europe, but they too are caught in the middle. They must balance the demands of the imperial government, which expects them to regulate foreign trade, with the desires of the foreign traders who are eager to buy Chinese goods. The most powerful of these Hong merchants is a man named Haokua, who, in 1800, is regarded as the richest man on earth. Haokua's wealth is staggering. He is said to be worth around $26 million, a fortune that, when adjusted for inflation, would be worth billions of dollars today. Haokua's vaults are said to be so vast that in the event of a fire in 1822, rivers of silver reportedly flowed through the streets of Canton as his treasure was consumed by the flames. Haokua, dressed in his fine silk robes, stands as a symbol of China's economic might. But even his wealth cannot protect him from the inevitable changes that are on the horizon. In this time, China is at its peak, and yet, beneath the surface, cracks are beginning to form in the empire's facade. The opium trade is about to begin, and it will set in motion a chain of events that will ultimately lead to China's fall from grace. The trade between China and the West is highly imbalanced. The foreigners have nothing that China desires, and so they are forced to pay for their Chinese goods with silver. The British, in particular, find themselves running out of silver. They have spent so much on Chinese goods that their coffers are nearly empty. And so, the British East India Company, a powerful trading entity controlled by the British Crown, is faced with a problem: how to balance the trade. The solution, they believe, lies in opium. Opium is not new to China. For centuries, the Chinese have used it for medicinal purposes. It was often consumed as a tincture or in small quantities for its pain-relieving properties. However, it was the British who would change the way opium was consumed in China. The British East India Company had begun to cultivate opium in India, particularly in Bengal, and by the early 19th century, they were producing massive quantities of the drug. The British needed to find a market for the opium they were growing, and China, with its insatiable appetite for luxury goods, was the perfect place. The British, with their vast colonial holdings, had no shortage of opium. They saw it as a commodity they could easily sell to the Chinese in exchange for silver, which they could then use to buy Chinese goods. The opium trade was, at first, a small operation, and many of the Chinese authorities remained unaware of the scale of the smuggling operation. But as the demand for opium grew, so did the smuggling networks that brought the drug into China. The British East India Company, eager to profit, continued to flood the market with opium, and soon it began to spread beyond the elite circles to the broader population. At first, opium use was limited to the rich, the elite, and the powerful. It was a luxury drug, consumed in ornate pipes by government officials, merchants, and wealthy citizens. But as the demand for opium grew, so did its availability. In Canton, opium dens began to spring up, and it wasn't long before the drug began to spread across the country, reaching the lower classes as well. What started as a simple luxury for the elite had, within a matter of years, become an epidemic. As the addiction spread, China's economy began to deteriorate. The silver that had once poured into the empire from foreign trade began to flow out, as foreign merchants exchanged their opium for Chinese silver. The wealth that had once been so plentiful began to dwindle, and the balance of trade was completely overturned. Instead of silver flowing into China to pay for its luxurious goods, silver began to flow out, fueling the opium trade and accelerating China's decline. The addiction to opium began to weaken China's workforce, sapping the empire's strength and productivity. Families were torn apart as people spent their money on opium instead of food or necessities. The very fabric of Chinese society began to unravel. What had once been a self-sufficient empire now found itself dependent on a foreign substance. a drug that not only drained its resources but also shattered the morale of its people. The imperial government, still largely unaware of the scale of the problem, continued to turn a blind eye to the opium epidemic, believing that it was a matter of personal choice rather than a national crisis. But the opium trade was spreading faster than anyone could imagine, and by the time the government finally took action, it was already too late. In the streets of Canton, the opium dens are full, and the drug has permeated every level of society. The addiction is no longer confined to the rich elite. People from all walks of life are now caught in the grip of opium, and with it, the future of China itself is slipping away. But the emperor, isolated in the capital, is slow to react. The Qing Dynasty, once the most powerful and prosperous empire on earth, is beginning its long descent into ruin, brought down not by foreign guns or invaders, but by a flower, a plant that, over time, will destroy everything China once stood for. The empire that had once stood as the center of civilization, untouched by the outside world, was now crumbling from within, and opium, a simple drug, was at the heart of its downfall. The story of how opium began to seep into China is one of slow but inexorable change, a change that was almost imperceptible at first but would, over the course of decades, reshape the destiny of the empire. The year is still 1800, and as you continue to walk through the busy streets of Canton, it's hard to imagine that something as insidious as opium could disrupt the lives of millions and bring down a civilization that has existed for millennia. However, unbeknownst to the average citizen, a profound shift is already underway in the shadows of the city. You watch as foreign merchants, British, Americans, and Dutch, gather at the port, unloading their cargo with a sense of urgency and ambition. These merchants, while eager to sell their European goods, have found an even more profitable commodity to trade: opium. This seemingly innocent drug, known for its medicinal properties, has now become a lucrative business for those looking to balance the immense trade deficit they face with China. The British East India Company, with its extensive network in India, quickly realizes that opium can be the solution to their problem. The British have long sought access to the immense wealth of China, yet they are frustrated by the refusal of the Chinese emperor to trade with them on equal terms. China, as far as the emperor is concerned, needs nothing from the West, and the British find themselves paying for Chinese luxury goods, silk, porcelain, and tea almost entirely in silver, draining their coffers with little to show for it. But in India, under British control, the East India Company is cultivating opium on a large scale, and soon, the British realize that opium could serve as the perfect currency to reverse the trade imbalance. Opium is not new to China. The Chinese have long used opium for medicinal purposes, though mostly in small quantities. It's used to relieve pain, treat ailments, and even in certain rituals. The idea of smoking opium, however, is foreign to China. Europeans, particularly the British, introduced this new practice, smoking opium for pleasure, a luxury at first, but one that is poised to become highly addictive. As the British begin shipping more and more opium into China, they take advantage of a subtle, yet critical loophole in the law. Opium was technically illegal in China, but it was largely a medicinal substance used by the wealthy for pain relief. It is only when the British begin smuggling opium into China in large quantities, not just for medical use, but for recreational use, that its true impact begins to unfold. The British East India Company has a near monopoly on the opium trade, and they begin shipping thousands of chests of the drug to China annually. One chest contains about 140 pounds of opium, and by the early 1800s, this trade grows to about 4,500 chests per year. This is where the transformational shift begins. At first, opium is only consumed by the elite government officials, wealthy merchants, and the aristocracy. The opium dens in Canton and other coastal cities begin to cater to a specific class of people who use the drug for leisure, as a status symbol, as a way to escape the pressures of their otherwise demanding lives. They lounge in dimly lit rooms, the air thick with the pungent smell of burning opium. The pipes they use are carefully crafted, works of art themselves, with long stems and ornate metal bowls, creating an image of sophistication and indulgence. But this is only the beginning. As more and more foreign traders pour into Canton, the opium trade expands, and its use spreads beyond the elite. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to infiltrate the lives of ordinary Chinese people. The opium that once was a rare luxury for the rich is now becoming a product that is increasingly affordable to the common folk. Opium dens are no longer limited to the wealthy districts of Canton. They begin to pop up in working-class areas. The drug is no longer a symbol of wealth and status. It is a necessity, a way to escape the grinding poverty and hardship that many in China are beginning to face. The pace at which opium spreads across China is swift and subtle. With every new shipment that arrives at the Canton harbor, the influence of opium grows. The addiction that once confined itself to the upper echelons of society begins to spread among laborers, farmers, and craftsmen. It's not long before entire communities are hooked on opium. Its allure is undeniable. Opium promises a temporary escape from the hardships of life, from hunger, poverty, and disease. And for those who can afford it, it offers the dream of a paradise, a world where the harshness of reality can be temporarily forgotten. Opium addiction becomes more than just a personal issue. It begins to affect the very structure of society. As the drug takes hold of the population, the effects on the economy and society become increasingly devastating. People begin spending all their earnings on opium. Laborers who once toiled from dawn to dusk find themselves too weak to work, their energy drained by the insidious grip of addiction. Farmers abandon their fields, workers abandon their workshops, and families suffer. The economy of entire regions begins to slow down as more and more individuals fall under the sway of opium. Productivity plummets. In the streets of Canton, opium dens are overflowing. The rich, the poor, and everyone in between gather in these dens, smoking the drug to escape their daily struggles. As the demand for opium increases, the number of foreign merchants eager to supply it grows as well. British merchants, primarily through the British East India Company, begin to dominate the opium trade. They are well aware of the growing addiction, and as the supply of opium grows, so does the demand. What started as a trade imbalance problem for the British, their need to balance their silver outflows, is now a full-fledged epidemic. Opium, once considered a medicinal substance, has morphed into a dangerous commodity, one that is slowly weakening China from the inside out. As the addiction spreads, so does the drug. Its impact is no longer confined to the cities along the coast. Slowly, it moves inland, reaching rural areas, where the once self-sufficient farmers are now dependent on a foreign drug. The addiction to opium is turning China into a land of addicts, unable to sustain its power. The opium trade has now become deeply embedded in the fabric of China's society. The silver that once flowed into the country is now flowing out at an unprecedented rate, draining the Chinese economy. And with the outflow of silver comes a draining of strength. China's once proud self-sufficiency is beginning to slip away. The Hong merchants, once some of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the country, find themselves caught between the demands of the Chinese government, which is desperate to maintain its grip on the economy, and the foreign traders who are now essential to their wealth. The emperor in Beijing, far removed from the day-to-day life in Canton, remains largely unaware of the true scale of the opium epidemic that is sweeping the nation. The emperor, isolated from the reality of life in the cities, does not fully understand the gravity of the situation. He is unaware of how the addiction is affecting the lives of the people, how it is eroding the foundation of the Chinese empire. But it will not be long before the emperor is forced to confront this growing crisis. As the opium trade continues to expand, China begins to face the consequences of its complacency. The government, slow to act, begins to realize the catastrophic effects of opium on the economy and society. Silver is flowing out of the country. Addiction is weakening the workforce, and entire regions are experiencing a decline in productivity. But the Qing Dynasty is ill-prepared to deal with the foreign intrusion and the growing internal turmoil caused by opium. The empire that once stood at the center of the world now finds itself in a battle not just against foreign forces, but against a drug that is destroying its very soul. And thus, in the shadows of Canton Harbor, the seeds of destruction are being sown. What started as a trade imbalance, a simple issue of economics, is now becoming a catastrophe that will alter the course of history forever. Opium, once an innocent medicinal plant, has become a weapon of destruction, one that will weaken China's greatest empire, setting the stage for a confrontation that will reverberate for centuries to come. What began as a small, covert trade in opium will soon turn into the most significant crisis China has ever faced. The balance of power in Asia is about to shift, and the consequences of that shift will not only affect China but the entire world. By the time we reach the early 1832s, China's once thriving economy begins to show signs of decay, and the social fabric that held the empire together starts to unravel. The widespread addiction to opium is no longer a hidden, subversive force. It is now an epidemic that reaches deep into all levels of Chinese society. The streets of Canton and other major cities are filled with people, men, women, young and old, seeking solace in opium dens, where they lose themselves in the comforting embrace of the drug. What began as a luxury for the rich and the elite has quickly transformed into a crisis that affects millions of ordinary Chinese citizens. The economic and social consequences of this addiction are far-reaching. The once bustling trade in silk, tea, porcelain, and other luxury goods has slowed. What had been a thriving, self-sufficient empire is now dependent on foreign goods, and opium has begun to take a toll on the productivity of the Chinese people. Farmers who once worked the fertile fields of the interior now find themselves too weak to cultivate crops, too consumed by their addiction to work the land that was once their livelihood. Laborers in the cities no longer have the energy or willpower to work long hours, and the workshops that once produced goods for both domestic use and export fall silent. Industries that had made China one of the wealthiest nations in the world now struggle under the weight of the addiction that has seeped into the heart of society. Families that once thrived on the sweat of their brows now find themselves broken as men and women trade their earnings for opium, leaving their families to starve. In many homes, children watch helplessly as their parents slip further into addiction, their futures destroyed by a drug that was initially introduced as a luxury, but now, through its pervasiveness, is leading to destitution. What was once a powerful, united empire, capable of remarkable achievements, is now losing its strength from within, as its people crumble under the weight of addiction. The silver that had once flowed into China from foreign trade has reversed course, now flowing out of the country at an alarming rate to pay for the opium that sustains the addiction. In this atmosphere of economic and social collapse, a new sense of urgency begins to take shape within the Chinese government. The emperor, who had remained largely unaware of the scale of the problem, is now confronted with the reality of what opium is doing to his empire. A sense of crisis begins to rise within the imperial court, and the emperor's advisors urge him to take action. The Qing Dynasty's once unquestioned authority is beginning to slip, and those in power understand that drastic measures must be taken to stop the flood of opium from further destabilizing the nation. It is at this point that Commissioner Lin Zexu, one of the most capable and incorruptible officials in the Qing government, is tasked with addressing the opium crisis. Lin, known for his stern resolve and commitment to Chinese sovereignty, is sent to Canton in 1839 with a singular mission: end the opium trade. For Lin, this is not just an economic issue, but a moral one. He believes that the foreign drug dealers, along with the corrupt officials who turn a blind eye to the problem, are poisoning China from the inside out. The opium crisis for him is a matter of national survival, and he is determined to put an end to it. Upon arriving in Canton, Lin is struck by the magnitude of the problem. The city's opium dens are packed with addicts, and foreign traders continue to bring in shiploads of the drug. He begins his campaign by taking the bold step of seizing and destroying the opium supplies stored in the city. Lin demands that the foreign merchants surrender their opium stockpiles, warning them that failure to comply will have severe consequences. To make his intentions clear, he orders the destruction of more than 1,000 chests of opium, worth millions of silver dollars, by dumping them into the sea. The destruction of the opium is symbolic. It is a message to both the Chinese people and the foreign powers. China will no longer tolerate the destruction of its society through foreign drugs. Lin's actions set off a chain reaction. The British traders, who rely heavily on the opium trade, are furious. The destruction of the drug supplies is a direct affront to their profits, and they demand that the Chinese government compensate them for the loss. But Lin's resolve remains firm. He refuses to back down, convinced that the health and survival of China is more important than the profits of foreign traders. This conflict, centered around the destruction of opium, becomes the flashpoint that sets the stage for the Opium War. As the situation in Canton escalates, the British government, led by Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, begins to take a more active role in the conflict. The British see the actions of Lin Zexu as an unprovoked attack on their interests and decide that they must defend their trade rights by force. The British East India Company, the key driver of the opium trade, lobbies the British government to take military action against China to protect its financial investments. The British government, which has long been seeking to expand its influence in China, sees an opportunity to punish the Chinese and establish greater control over the country's trade. The British response comes swiftly. In 1840, British warships, equipped with modern steam engines, begin to make their way to China. The Opium War is now inevitable. The British military, with its advanced technology and naval superiority, is confident that China's old-fashioned forces will not be able to resist. The Qing Dynasty, with its military largely relying on traditional tactics and weapons, is about to be confronted with a new type of warfare, one based on industrial might and technological innovation. The opening shots of the First Opium War are fired in 1840, and it becomes clear that the British forces are vastly superior to the Chinese military. The British Navy, armed with cannon and explosive shells, destroys Chinese coastal defenses with ease, and the British Army swiftly overwhelms Chinese forces in a series of battles along the coast. The Chinese government, already struggling with the effects of opium addiction and internal instability, finds itself unprepared for the military might of the British. The war that follows will last for 3 years, and it will be one of the most humiliating defeats in Chinese history. The Qing Dynasty, once an empire that controlled one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world, will be forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, an agreement that will fundamentally alter China's place in the world. The treaty that ends the Opium War is one of the most unequal agreements ever imposed on a nation. China is forced to pay a massive indemnity to Britain, cede Hong Kong to British control, and open 5 major ports to foreign trade. The opium trade, which China had hoped to end, continues and expands. The British, victorious in war, gain significant trade privileges, and the sovereignty of China is significantly compromised. The Treaty of Nanking marks the beginning of a new era for China, one in which foreign powers will exert greater influence over the country's politics, economy, and territory. It is the first in a series of unequal treaties that will gradually chip away at China's independence, setting the stage for a century of humiliation, during which China will struggle to recover its strength and sovereignty. The destruction of opium, the very catalyst of the conflict, is, ironically, just the beginning of a far greater crisis. The Opium War will change the course of China's history, and the repercussions of this war will be felt for generations to come. The Qing Dynasty will never fully recover from the blows it has suffered, and the opium epidemic will continue to plague the country for decades. The British have won, but they have also set in motion a series of events that will lead to China's eventual downfall, not because of foreign armies, but because of addiction, a simple flower transformed into a weapon of economic warfare. As the war ends and the Treaty of Nanking is signed, you, the observer, realize the weight of what has just transpired. The world has changed. The greatest empire on earth has been humbled, its resources drained, its pride shattered. The balance of power in Asia is shifting, and China, once the center of civilization, is about to experience a period of decline unlike any it has known before. The destruction of opium may have been the original goal, but it is only the beginning of China's painful journey into the future. The Opium Wars have begun, and China's struggle to reclaim its sovereignty and rebuild its strength is only just starting. As the First Opium War rages on, the reality of China's vulnerability to foreign influence becomes brutally clear. While the Qing Dynasty had once stood as the most powerful empire in the world, the introduction of opium has revealed cracks in the empire's structure that cannot be ignored. The opium addiction crisis, which had already weakened the nation from within, now meets the external threat of British military might, and the consequences are disastrous. The Chinese government, under the reign of the Daoguang Emperor, faces an unprecedented dilemma. The emperor's court is divided. Some officials believe the foreign barbarians should be dealt with cautiously, while others, like Commissioner Lin Zexu, are adamant that China must stand firm and expel the Western drug dealers who have brought the country to the brink of collapse. Lin Zexu, who had taken a hard stance against opium smugglers, is one of the few who recognizes the existential threat posed by opium. His actions in 1839, seizing and destroying vast quantities of opium and ordering the dismantling of foreign opium warehouses, are the spark that sets the conflict in motion. However, Lin Zexu's efforts come at a great cost. His uncompromising stance towards the opium trade ignites the fury of the British. The British East India Company, which had been running the opium trade as a highly profitable enterprise, lobbies the British government for action. The British demand reparations for the destroyed opium, but Commissioner Lin is resolute. He has no intention of backing down, even as foreign pressure mounts. Britain's response to Lin's actions is swift. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, is incensed by the Chinese government's treatment of British merchants, and he sees it as an affront to British dignity and commerce. The British military, equipped with modern steam-powered warships, cannon, and explosive shells, is sent to China with orders to demand reparations and ensure the continuation of the opium trade. The British Navy, under Sir Hugh Gough, arrives at the coast of China in 1840, and the First Opium War begins. The military engagement is one-sided from the outset. The Chinese military, relying on traditional weaponry such as swords and spears, is no match for the British forces, who possess advanced firepower and superior naval technology. The British warships, equipped with steam engines, can move against the wind, giving them unparalleled maneuverability on the sea. The Chinese, still relying on wooden junks, are unable to compete with the might of the British fleet. In addition to the naval superiority, the British Army is far better trained and equipped, and they quickly gain the upper hand in every battle. As the war continues, the British forces systematically bombard Chinese coastal cities, including Canton, Ningbo, and Amoy. The Chinese attempt to defend their ports, but their outdated weaponry proves ineffective against the British onslaught. One of the key battles occurs at the Bogue forts, where the Chinese attempt to defend access to the Pearl River, a crucial waterway for trade. The British attack with a force that includes naval bombardment, followed by a land assault. Despite their superior tactics and technology, the Chinese defenders hold their ground for a time, but they are ultimately overpowered. As the war progresses, the effects on China become increasingly severe. Trade routes are cut off, the economy is crippled, and civilian casualties rise. The Chinese, unable to match the British technologically, are forced to surrender one city after another. Eventually, the imperial court, realizing the gravity of the situation, begins negotiations with the British. The Qing government is forced to admit its inability to repel the invaders, and in 1842, the Treaty of Nanking is signed. The Treaty of Nanking is one of the most unequal treaties ever forced upon a nation. The terms are humiliating for China. It is compelled to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, a critical loss of territorial sovereignty. 5 major ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, are open to foreign trade. British merchants are granted extraterritorial rights, meaning they are no longer subject to Chinese law, and they can operate with impunity within these ports. The Chinese government is forced to pay a massive indemnity in silver to the British to cover the costs of the war, as well as compensation for the destroyed opium. Additionally, the opium trade is allowed to continue, despite China's efforts to end it. The treaty solidifies the British monopoly on the trade and ensures that opium will continue to flow into China. The signing of the Treaty of Nanking marks the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a period when foreign powers Britain, France, and later Japan will impose their will on China. The country is forced to open its doors to foreign trade and influence, and its sovereignty is severely undermined. The Qing Dynasty, once the most powerful empire in the world, is now effectively at the mercy of foreign powers. Though the First Opium War ends in 1842, the damage inflicted on China's pride and economy is irreparable. The empire is divided, and its social fabric weakened by the ongoing addiction to opium. The opium trade, far from being halted, grows exponentially, and more foreign powers take advantage of China's weakened state, seeking their own concessions and territorial control. The Second Opium War is just around the corner, as the British, not content with the Treaty of Nanking, press for further advantages in the years following the First War. The consequences of the opium trade are not confined to economic loss alone. The addiction that spread through the population has had a profound social impact. Families are torn apart as addicts sell everything they own to feed their addiction. The workforce weakens, with people too consumed by opium to work or contribute meaningfully to society. Agriculture declines as farmers turn to opium cultivation to make quick money, replacing rice paddies with poppy fields. Cities suffer, as the once thriving hubs of commerce and culture are increasingly populated by the desperate and the addicted. Opium dens become more than just places of escape. They become symbols of the decay that is eating away at the empire's core. The Qing Dynasty, unable to cope with the growing addiction and the external pressure from Western powers, begins to lose its grip on power. Corruption runs rampant within the imperial court, and the emperor's advisors, many of whom are addicted to opium themselves, are no longer able to govern effectively. Local uprisings become more frequent, as peasants who have suffered under the weight of addiction and economic decline begin to rise up against the ruling elite. These uprisings will eventually give rise to some of the most catastrophic conflicts in China's history, including the Taiping Rebellion, which will claim millions of lives. The end of the First Opium War marks a significant turning point in Chinese history. For China, it is the beginning of a long and painful period of decline, both socially and politically. The loss of Hong Kong, the opening of the treaty ports, and the continued flow of opium into the country will set the stage for further foreign encroachments. The Qing Dynasty, weakened by both internal problems and foreign pressure, struggles to maintain control over its vast territories. The opium epidemic continues to spread, deepening China's problems and further destabilizing the nation. For the British, the victory in the First Opium War is seen as a triumph of Western civilization over the barbarian East. Their dominance in global trade is solidified, and they now have unfettered access to the Chinese market. The opium trade becomes the backbone of British economic interests in Asia, while the Chinese, having been forced to accept the terms of the treaty, are left to cope with the devastating aftermath. But this victory will not last forever. Despite the immediate triumphs of the British, the humiliation of the Chinese people and the damage inflicted on their empire will not be easily forgotten. The Opium Wars have set in motion a cycle of decline from which China will take decades to recover. And while foreign powers continue to extract wealth and resources from China, the seeds of resentment and rebellion are being planted, ones that will eventually lead to China's eventual transformation not by force of arms, but through internal upheaval and revolution. The battle for China's future is far from over, and the opium trade, though severely crippled by the treaties, will continue to play a critical role in the evolution of the nation for years to come. It will take more than treaties, wars, and concessions to heal the deep wounds that have been inflicted on China's soul. The empire, once at the height of its power, will continue to struggle with the effects of opium for decades. The legacy of addiction, both to the drug and to the power of foreign nations, will continue to haunt the country until the dawn of the 20th century. But for now, the Opium Wars have reshaped China's relationship with the rest of the world. The opium that once flowed freely into the empire now flows under the auspices of foreign treaties and the threat of military force. The opium trade has irrevocably altered the course of China's history, and the Qing Dynasty, once unshakable, begins its long, slow slide into irrelevance. As the treaty ports open and the foreign presence in China grows, the once proud Middle Kingdom is forced to accept a new reality. It is no longer the center of the world, but a country divided and exploited by the very forces it once considered beneath it. The Opium Wars are not just a tale of military conflict. They are a reminder of how empire, addiction, and greed can destroy a once mighty nation from the inside out. The war is won, but China is forever changed. The aftermath of the Opium Wars leaves China reeling, its pride shattered, and its sovereignty compromised. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842, followed by the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and other unequal treaties, marks the beginning of a new era for China, an era of foreign domination and internal turmoil. The once mighty Qing Dynasty is now reduced to a shadow of its former self, its authority undermined both by the foreign powers that now hold sway over vast portions of the empire and by the addiction crisis that continues to ravage its population. In the wake of the treaties, foreign powers Britain, France, the United States, and later Japan seized territories, trade privileges, and special rights within China. These nations carve up the empire into spheres of influence, and China's autonomy is significantly weakened. The British secure Hong Kong, an island colony that becomes a critical center for their trade in the region. 5 treaty ports, Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Ningbo, and Fuzhou, are open to foreign trade, and foreign merchants are allowed to live and trade freely within them under extraterritorial rights that exempt them from Chinese laws. The most humiliating part of these treaties is not just the loss of territory or the payment of indemnities. It is the legalization and expansion of the opium trade that China had so desperately tried to end. While the Qing government fought to remove the opium that had plagued its society, The treaties codify the drug's place in Chinese commerce. The British East India Company and other foreign traders continue to flood China with opium, and the addiction that has already spread throughout the empire accelerates. In the cities of Canton, Shanghai, and Ningbo, opium dens continue to thrive. The addiction spreads further into the countryside, as the once thriving agricultural regions become dependent on the production of poppy fields to fuel both the domestic and foreign markets. China, once a self-sufficient empire, now finds itself dependent on foreign trade, foreign control, and, most tragically, foreign drugs. The economic impact of the Opium Wars is devastating. Silver flows out of China at an ever-increasing rate, and the Qing government's tax system begins to collapse under the weight of inflation and corruption. The national treasury is drained by the war indemnities and the costs of maintaining the treaties. The foreign presence in China grows, and with it, the economic exploitation of the country's resources intensifies. The local population becomes increasingly impoverished as the foreign powers establish monopolies over China's trade, while Chinese merchants and farmers are increasingly marginalized. Meanwhile, the social fabric of Chinese society is disintegrating. Families are torn apart by opium addiction, and once productive communities are now devastated by the poverty and depression that addiction brings. The once mighty Confucian ideals that held Chinese society together seem to fade under the weight of foreign influence, addiction, and disillusionment. The Qing Dynasty's power is eroded as local governors and officials, many of whom are also addicted to opium, fail to maintain control over their regions. Though the Qing Dynasty continues to hold on to power, it is clear that it is no longer the unchallenged force it once was. The emperor's authority is increasingly questioned, and the Chinese people, particularly those living in the cities and regions hardest hit by addiction and foreign influence, begin to demand reform. The foreigners, with their wealth, power, and the ability to operate outside Chinese law, continue to grow in influence. Even the Hong merchants, who were once the richest individuals in China, now find themselves caught between the demands of the Qing government and the British and other foreign powers who exert increasing control over their businesses. The opium epidemic continues to plague China for decades, and the Qing government struggles to contain it. Despite efforts to restrict opium production and eradicate addiction, the demand for the drug remains high, and the foreign powers are more than happy to supply it. The once isolated empire now finds itself exposed to the economic forces of the global market, and China's loss of independence becomes painfully evident. As the years pass, the opium trade continues to flourish, even as the Chinese people grow increasingly disillusioned with the Qing government's inability to address their problems. The First Opium War may have ended with China's surrender, but it marked the beginning of a new phase of foreign intervention and exploitation. Foreign powers, no longer content with the treaty ports, demand more territorial concessions and economic privileges. The Second Opium War is on the horizon, and with it, even more humiliation and territorial losses for China. By the time the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, begins, the situation in China has deteriorated significantly. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, one of the deadliest civil wars in history, erupts in response to the economic decline and social upheaval caused by the aftermath of the First Opium War and the continuing addiction crisis. The rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, gains widespread support among the disaffected and oppressed masses, many of whom are victims of the opium trade. The Qing Dynasty, already weakened by its defeat in the First Opium War and the subsequent treaties, now faces an internal rebellion that threatens to tear apart the very fabric of its empire. While the British and French forces, who have been expanding their presence in China, take advantage of the chaos to further their own territorial ambitions. The Qing government finds itself fighting on two fronts, a foreign invasion and a massive internal revolt. The Second Opium War results in further losses for China, with the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860, which forced China to open more ports to foreign trade, grant even greater concessions to foreign powers, and allow foreign diplomats to be stationed in Beijing, the heart of the Chinese Empire. Hong Kong is further expanded, and more territory is ceded to the British, who continue to dominate the opium trade. Christian missionaries gain protection under the treaties, and their influence spreads, undermining traditional Confucian values and contributing to the disillusionment of many Chinese citizens. The opium crisis shows no sign of abating. In fact, it worsens as domestic opium production begins to exceed the opium smuggled in from foreign traders. By the 1872, China becomes the world's largest producer of opium, and the drug trade continues to eat away at the nation's soul. The social fabric of China continues to deteriorate, and the once proud empire becomes a shadow of its former self. The damage wrought by the Opium Wars and the opium trade is incalculable. Silver continues to flow out of China to pay for the opium, and the country's economy remains in ruins. The Qing Dynasty, unable to recover from the losses inflicted by the Opium Wars, is forced to confront not only the challenges posed by foreign powers, but also the growing unrest within its own borders. In the 20th century, China will continue to struggle with the legacy of the Opium Wars. While the Republic of China is founded in 1912, it will inherit a nation scarred by addiction, exploitation, and foreign control. It will take until 1949, with the founding of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, for the country to finally begin to address the lasting damage caused by the Opium Wars. The consequences of the Opium Wars continue to reverberate throughout Chinese history. They mark the beginning of a long period of national humiliation and exploitation, but they also serve as a powerful reminder of how foreign intervention, driven by greed and addiction, can destabilize even the greatest empires. As China begins to rebuild in the mid-20th century, the legacy of the Opium Wars serves as a catalyst for the country's eventual transformation, pushing it to become a modern and sovereign nation once again. However, the shadow of the poppy, the symbol of the opium trade, remains a powerful reminder of the struggles and sacrifices China endured during its century of humiliation. The aftermath of the Opium Wars marked the beginning of an era of profound change for China. While the immediate effects of the treaties, the loss of territory, the introduction of extraterritorial rights, and the continuation of the opium trade were devastating, they also set in motion the rise of Chinese nationalism. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, which forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and opened several key ports to foreign trade, was not just a diplomatic humiliation, it was the catalyst for a national awakening. For the first time in centuries, the Chinese people, from the imperial court to the rural peasants, began to question their nation's place in the world. The psychological scars of the Opium Wars were deep. China had long considered itself the center of civilization, the Middle Kingdom surrounded by less sophisticated barbarians. But with the arrival of foreign imperialists, this belief was shattered. The Chinese had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their ancient empire had fallen behind the West in military, industrial, and scientific development. More than just losing land or wealth, China had lost its prestige and self-respect on the world stage. Despite the pain of this reality, the years following the Opium Wars saw the emergence of a new spirit among the Chinese people, intellectuals and reformers, many of them deeply influenced by Western ideas they encountered through their interactions with foreigners, began to advocate for change. They recognized that China's survival depended on the modernization of its political system, military capabilities, and economy. This period marked the beginning of a profound shift in thought as China faced the challenges of industrialization and globalization. At the forefront of these early reform efforts was the self-strengthening movement, 1861 to 1895, a series of initiatives aimed at modernizing China's military and industry by adopting Western technologies while retaining traditional Chinese values. The movement was spearheaded by influential reformists like Zhuo Zongtang and Li Hongzhang, who understood that China's internal stability and external defense could only be achieved through modernization. The self-strengthening program included the establishment of arsenals, the development of a navy, and efforts to reform the educational system by establishing institutions that would teach Western sciences and engineering. However, despite its noble intentions, the self-strengthening movement faced significant resistance. Conservatives within the imperial court, including influential figures in the Confucian bureaucracy, feared that the adoption of Western ideas would undermine traditional Chinese values. Their resistance to change slowed the momentum of reform, and while the movement succeeded in some areas, it failed to produce the comprehensive transformation needed to defend China from foreign powers. Moreover, the internal problems plaguing China, corruption, poverty, and the opium crisis, were not addressed by these reforms. The growing realization that the Qing Dynasty was unable to protect China from foreign encroachment and internal disorder led to the rise of new voices demanding radical change. These voices came from both within the imperial system and from outside the government. By the late 19th century, intellectuals, military leaders, and activists began to publicly call for the overthrow of the imperial system and the establishment of a new, more modern form of government. This period witnessed the rise of nationalist sentiment and a desire for revolution that would eventually culminate in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, further highlighted the failure of the Qing dynasty's reforms. The war, fought over control of Korea, resulted in a humiliating defeat for China. The Japanese, who had rapidly industrialized and modernized their military forces, crushed the Chinese forces with ease. This defeat underscored the growing gap between China and the rising powers of the industrialized world. The war was not only a military disaster, but also a national disgrace, as it demonstrated that China's traditional military systems and defenses were no match for the modernized forces of a much smaller, industrialized nation. In the aftermath of this crushing defeat, reformers and revolutionaries saw the only viable solution was to completely overhaul the political and military structures of the empire. Sun Yat-sen, a prominent reformist leader, began to advocate for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of a republic based on democratic principles. Later, Sun's vision for a new China was a radical departure from the old imperial system. He saw Western-style republicanism and nationalism as the only way to restore China's sovereignty and protect it from the kind of foreign exploitation that had plagued the country for nearly a century. While Sun Yat-sen's calls for revolution gained support, the Qing dynasty was still able to maintain power. However, its hold on the country was increasingly tenuous. The dynasty's inability to control the country's economy, military, and administration in the face of internal strife and foreign pressures led to increasing unrest among the people. The opium epidemic, meanwhile, continued to sap the vitality of Chinese society. Opium addiction remained widespread, and entire generations were born into a society ravaged by both foreign exploitation and internal decay. The culmination of this growing discontent came in the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which brought an end to more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. The revolution was sparked by a series of uprisings and a widespread desire for change. After the abdication of the last emperor, Puyi, the Republic of China was born. This marked the end of the Qing Dynasty and the beginning of a new, though troubled, chapter in Chinese history. Though China was now officially a republic, the country was far from stable. The new republic struggled with regional warlords, continuing foreign influence, and a deeply divided population. Despite these challenges, the fall of the Qing Dynasty represented a new beginning. China's journey toward modernity had begun, though it would take decades of struggle and sacrifice before the country could recover fully from the devastating impacts of the Opium Wars and foreign imperialism. The lessons of the Opium Wars, the importance of national unity, sovereignty, and economic independence, would remain central to China's political and social discourse for the coming century. As China entered the 20th century, the consequences of the Opium Wars continued to reverberate throughout its society. The century of humiliation had left deep scars, but it also ignited a spirit of resistance and a longing for reform that would fuel China's transformation in the years to come. The early decades of the Republic of China, founded in 1912, were marked by attempts to rebuild the nation's strength and recover its sovereignty. Yet, despite the fall of the Qing Dynasty, the foreign powers remained entrenched in China, and opium continued to be a significant problem. The early years of the Republic were tumultuous. China was beset by internal divisions, regional warlordism, and the ongoing influence of foreign powers. Though the Nationalist Party, led by figures like Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek, sought to modernize the country, they faced significant obstacles. These included the need to unify the country, combat foreign exploitation, and address the legacy of opium that had plagued China for a century. The nationalist movement that emerged in the early 20th century was fueled by a desire to reclaim China's sovereignty and restore the nation to its former glory. The May 4th movement of 1919, which was sparked by student protests in Beijing, called for the rejection of foreign influence, the adoption of modern scientific principles, and the reinvigoration of Chinese culture. The movement marked a key turning point, as it galvanized a generation of young people who would play a significant role in shaping China's future. It was during this time that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, began to gain influence, inspired by Marxist and Leninist ideas that had taken hold in Russia. The CCP's emergence was a response to the failures of the nationalist government and the deepening social and economic inequality in China. Led by Mao Zedong, the party's influence grew in the countryside, particularly in regions where the effects of opium addiction and foreign exploitation were felt most acutely. Despite the rise of the communist movement, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek initially made some efforts to modernize China's economy and military. The 1932nd saw some success in addressing corruption and opium addiction, though it was clear that China's political instability and lack of industrial strength left it vulnerable to external threats, particularly from Japan. The Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945, which became part of the larger World War II conflict, was a turning point for China. Japan's brutal invasion and occupation of Chinese territory further exposed the weaknesses of China's military and political systems, but it also fueled a renewed sense of nationalism. The war united many factions in China, as both the nationalists and communists fought to resist Japanese occupation. Following the war, China's internal struggles resumed. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and communists, which had been interrupted by the Japanese invasion, resumed with full force. In 1949, after years of conflict and upheaval, Mao Zedong's communist forces emerged victorious. The establishment of the People's Republic of China marked the end of the century of humiliation and the beginning of a new chapter in China's long and complex history. The legacy of the Opium Wars and the foreign exploitation that followed remained central to the identity of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, in the early years of their rule, focused on eradicating opium addiction and addressing the lingering economic and social problems that had been exacerbated by the Opium Wars. Mass campaigns were launched to eliminate opium cultivation and drug addiction. Through harsh measures, the communist government succeeded in eradicating opium on a large scale, and this victory became a symbol of China's resurgence. Yet, the legacy of the Opium Wars was not just about the opium itself. The wars had deeply shaped China's relationship with the rest of the world. The memory of foreign imperialism, exploitation, and national humiliation became a central element of the Chinese Communist Party's narrative. The Opium Wars served as a potent reminder of the importance of sovereignty, and they informed China's foreign policy as the country began to reassert its place on the global stage. China's recovery from the Opium Wars, though long and difficult, eventually allowed it to rise again as a modern nation. The economic reforms initiated under Deng Xiaoping in the late 20th century helped China reclaim its economic independence, while its military modernization and international standing became key components of its rise as a global power. Today, China stands as a leader on the world stage, with its economic strength and global influence a far cry from the humiliation and weakness that characterized its experience with the Opium Wars. Though the past cannot be erased, it is clear that China's journey from the Opium Wars to modernity is a story of resilience, recovery, and reassertion of sovereignty. The country's rise is a testament to the endurance of its people and their determination to overcome even the greatest challenges. And as China moves into the future, it continues to carry with it the lessons of the past, the lessons of the Opium Wars, reminding the world that even the most powerful empires can fall, but they can also rise again. As China entered the 20th century, it found itself at a crossroads. The Opium Wars, the humiliation of foreign powers, and the collapse of the Qing Dynasty left the country fractured, vulnerable, and deeply divided. Despite the dramatic changes that followed, the legacy of the Opium Wars and the long period of foreign exploitation continued to shape the political and social landscape. The journey to modernity would be long and arduous, and it would take decades of struggle, revolution, and reform before China could rise from the ashes of its imperial past. The Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, had struggled with internal corruption, external pressure, and the growing influence of Western powers. The impact of the Opium Wars, in which China had been forced to open its ports to foreign trade, cede territories like Hong Kong to Britain, and allow the opium trade to flourish, had fundamentally altered the nation's relationship with the rest of the world. The dynasty's failure to respond effectively to these threats was a major factor in its eventual downfall. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911, led by Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionary forces, brought an end to the Qing dynasty, marking the official collapse of over 2,000 years of imperial rule. But the revolution did not immediately bring stability to China. The newly formed Republic of China, founded in 1912, was fragile and divided, plagued by internal strife, warlordism, and an economy weakened by decades of exploitation. The country's political system was in disarray, and the ideas of democracy and republicanism struggled to take root in a nation still entrenched in centuries of imperial tradition. The early years of the Republic were marked by a political vacuum, as various factions fought for control. Warlords ruled over different parts of the country, and the central government in Beijing struggled to maintain authority. The Nationalist Party, Kuomintang or KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek, sought to unite China and bring it into the modern world. Yet the country was still deeply entrenched in the legacy of imperialism, and the national government faced constant challenges from foreign powers, internal instability, and the lingering effects of opium addiction that had ravaged much of the population for decades. In this turbulent period, a significant force emerged: Chinese nationalism. Nationalism, fueled by a desire for independence, sovereignty, and reform, became a driving force behind China's political and social changes. The May 4th movement of 1919 was a key event in the rise of Chinese nationalism. Sparked by anger over the Treaty of Versailles, which awarded former German concessions in China to Japan, the May 4th movement saw thousands of students and intellectuals take to the streets in protest. They demanded an end to foreign influence, an overhaul of China's educational system, and the adoption of modern scientific and democratic principles. The movement called for a cultural renaissance that would both reject traditional Confucian values and embrace the modern world, focusing on scientific progress and social reform. It marked a turning point in Chinese intellectual thought, with a new generation of thinkers calling for radical change. The May 4th movement also laid the groundwork for the rise of Chinese communism, as many of its participants would later join the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in the 1922. The early 20th century also saw the rise of communism in China, driven by the ideological impact of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Mao Zedong, one of the most prominent figures in the CCP, began advocating for a Marxist-Leninist revolution in China. The CCP sought to address the country's economic inequality and the exploitation of the peasantry, which had long been a central issue in Chinese society. Mao's belief in peasants as the revolutionary force was in stark contrast to the more urban-focused approach of the Kuomintang. The Communist Party, founded in 1921, gained traction among the rural population who had long been oppressed by landlords, the imperial system, and the foreign influence that dominated China's cities. However, the party initially struggled to gain power, and the KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, led the Republic of China in a series of attempts to consolidate control over the country. Chiang's nationalist government sought to modernize China's military and economy, but it was often hampered by corruption, infighting, and foreign influence. Meanwhile, foreign powers continued to exert control over China, particularly in the form of imperialism and the legacy of the Opium Wars. Japan, a rapidly rising imperial power, had begun to look at China as a strategic target for territorial expansion. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was a sign of things to come, as Japan sought to exert its control over China's northeast. The invasion marked the beginning of Japanese aggression in the region, which would later culminate in the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. During this period, China found itself in a precarious situation, caught between internal factions, nationalists and communists, and the growing external threat posed by Japan. The continuing presence of foreigners in Chinese cities, their control over trade, and their exploitation of the country's resources reminded the Chinese people of the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation they had endured. The desire to reclaim China's sovereignty and restore national pride became the central focus of the nationalist movement. Opium addiction, a product of the Opium Wars, remained a widespread problem throughout China, exacerbating the country's social issues. The Chinese government at the time lacked the resources and control to effectively address the addiction crisis. Despite the efforts of the Communist Party to address the problem, opium addiction remained rampant, and the population continued to suffer from its effects. The country's economic instability, foreign domination, and cultural upheaval left the Chinese people vulnerable to further exploitation and suffering. In the 1932, the Japanese occupation of Manchuria escalated into a full-scale war, and China's struggle for sovereignty reached its peak. The Second Sino-Japanese War became the backdrop for the eventual civil war between the nationalists and communists. While the two factions had initially been united in the face of the Japanese invasion, their rivalry resurfaced after Japan's defeat in 1945. The Chinese Civil War, 1945 to 1949, ended with the Communist Party's victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. The victory of the Communists marked the end of the Republican experiment and the beginning of Socialist China. Mao Zedong's government aimed to modernize China through centralized planning, land reforms, and the eradication of old cultural practices. One of the central goals of Mao's government was the eradication of opium addiction, a task that proved challenging given the scale of the problem. Mao's government used a combination of force, education, and re-education programs to address the issue of addiction. Opium cultivation was banned, and anti-drug campaigns were launched to remove opium from the country's social fabric. The Communist Party's success in eliminating opium from China was a significant achievement, but it came at a high cost. The methods used by the government were often harsh, and the cultural revolution that followed in the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds led to significant social disruption. In the following decades, China's economy gradually improved under Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which emphasized market-oriented policies and the opening of the economy to global trade. By the 21st century, China's rapid economic growth and global influence had transformed the country into a superpower in its own right. Yet, the legacy of the Opium Wars continued to be a central narrative in China's historical consciousness. The memory of the Opium Wars shaped China's foreign policy as it sought to assert its sovereignty and ensure that such a period of national humiliation would never be repeated. Nationalism and pride in China's recovery became central themes in Chinese politics, with a clear determination to never again fall victim to the forces of foreign imperialism. As China entered the 20th century, the legacy of the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation continued to shape the national consciousness. The country had endured over a century of exploitation, imperialism, and foreign intervention. However, the rise of Chinese communism, the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in 1949, and the subsequent economic reforms marked a new chapter in China's history, a chapter defined by a struggle for recovery, reform, and sovereignty. The Communist Party of China, CPC, led by Mao Zedong, won the Chinese Civil War, 1945-1949, resulting in the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao's victory marked the end of over 2 millennia of imperial rule and the beginning of a new, socialist era in Chinese history. The opium trade, which had played a significant role in weakening Chinese society and economy during the Opium Wars, was one of the first issues the communist government sought to address. For the communists, the eradication of opium addiction was not just a public health issue but also a symbolic rejection of the past. The opium trade had been at the heart of China's humiliation, with foreign powers using the drug to destabilize the country. The Opium Wars had started a cycle of exploitation and degradation, and now, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the government moved quickly to confront the scourge of opium, believing that by eliminating this persistent problem, they could break the chains of foreign control and restore China's sovereignty. In the early years of the People's Republic, Mao's government embarked on massive anti-opium campaigns. Opium cultivation was banned, and large-scale eradication programs were launched. The government implemented strict laws to root out the drug trade, while also re-educating addicts through re-education programs that combined medical treatments, moral guidance, and political indoctrination. The communist government was determined to not just wipe out drug addiction, but also eliminate the foreign influence and corruption that had enabled it. While the anti-opium efforts were largely successful, they came at a significant cost. Mao's government used draconian measures to enforce the ban on opium, often violently cracking down on suspected traffickers and addicts. The Cultural Revolution, 1966, 1976, an especially turbulent period in China's history, compounded the social unrest caused by the communist policies. But the campaign to rid China of opium addiction had a long-term positive impact, as the country was able to eliminate opium production and importation by the early 1950s. For many Chinese, this marked a symbolic break with the past, when foreign powers had forced opium upon them. Although opium eradication was a significant achievement for the PRC, other pressing challenges loomed large. The People's Republic of China was born into an era of economic poverty and social unrest. The Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937–1945, had devastated China's infrastructure, while decades of foreign exploitation and internal disorganization had left the country in tatters. Mao's vision for China's future focused on centralized economic planning, the collectivization of agriculture, and industrialization. But these would prove to be monumental tasks in a country still reeling from the effects of war, colonialism, and decades of stagnation. In 1953, Mao introduced the first five-year plan, which was modeled after the Soviet Union's approach to industrialization. The plan focused on rapidly transforming China's agrarian economy into an industrial powerhouse. The government sought to build a strong manufacturing base, and large state-owned industries were established. The first five-year plan also included the collectivization of agriculture, aiming to increase food production through state-controlled farms and rural collectives. However, while the first five-year plan had some success in boosting industrial output, it was marred by several issues, such as poor implementation, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and lack of expertise in managing such large-scale projects. Agricultural collectivization, in particular, faced resistance from peasants who were unwilling to surrender their land and livelihoods to the state. These failures were a harbinger of the long-term struggles China would face as it attempted to modernize its economy and bring its people out of poverty. The Great Leap Forward, initiated by Mao in 1958, was a more ambitious attempt at rapid industrialization and agricultural reform, but it quickly turned disastrous. The Great Leap Forward aimed to increase agricultural production through the creation of communes, while also focusing on heavy industry. The government encouraged peasants to work collectively and to focus on large-scale production, including the production of steel in backyard furnaces. Unfortunately, the plan failed due to over-reporting of crop yields, mismanagement, and political pressures. The results were catastrophic. Famine ravaged the country, and millions of people died from hunger and malnutrition. The agricultural sector collapsed, and the communist government was forced to backtrack, abandoning the commune system and introducing a more pragmatic approach to farming. The Great Leap Forward proved to be a disastrous failure and marked the beginning of a critical reevaluation of Mao's economic policies. In the wake of Mao's death in 1976, China's economic policies entered a period of profound transformation under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Deng, who had survived the political purges of the Cultural Revolution, became the paramount leader of China and began to steer the country away from the rigid central planning of the Mao era. His leadership would usher in a new era of economic reform that would reshape China's role in the world. In 1978, Deng introduced the Reform and Opening Up policy, which marked a dramatic shift in China's economic and political direction. Rather than continuing with strict communist central planning, Deng sought to integrate market forces into the economy while maintaining state control over key industries. Private enterprise was reintroduced, and foreign investment was encouraged. The Chinese government also began to privatize state-owned enterprises, allowing the market to dictate supply and demand, while still ensuring the government retained control over strategic sectors like energy, banking, and telecommunications. Deng's reforms were not just economic, they were also cultural and social. He advocated for the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics, a policy that blended Marxist principles with the pragmatism of economic growth. One of the most significant components of the reform process was the establishment of special economic zones, SEZs, where foreign companies could set up operations in China with fewer restrictions and greater incentives. Cities like Shenzhen rapidly transformed into bustling economic hubs, attracting both foreign direct investment and the technology that would help propel China into the 21st century. The opening up of the Chinese economy led to unprecedented growth. China's GDP began to rise sharply, and millions of people were lifted out of poverty. The government introduced new education policies, expanding access to education at all levels, and emphasized the importance of science and technology in fostering innovation. One of the key aspects of China's economic transformation was its export-oriented growth strategy. China quickly became known as the world's factory, producing a vast array of goods for global markets. The country's labor force, with its relatively low wages and large number of workers, attracted multinational corporations seeking to take advantage of China's manufacturing capabilities. As a result, China became deeply integrated into the global supply chain. By the turn of the 21st century, China's economic rise had transformed it from a poverty-stricken nation into a global powerhouse. In 2001, China became a member of the World Trade Organization, WTO, further solidifying its integration into the global economy. The country's rise was nothing short of astonishing. In just a few decades, it had become the second largest economy in the world, behind only the United States. China's economic success had profound implications for its political influence and global standing. As its economy grew, so did its military power, making it one of the most formidable forces in the world. China's foreign policy was no longer dictated by the forces of imperialism and foreign domination, but by its strategic interests, which often aligned with its role as a global economic leader. The legacy of the Opium Wars still looms large in China's foreign relations. The country's desire for sovereignty, respect, and self-determination has shaped its approach to the international order. The Opium Wars serve as a powerful reminder of how foreign powers can exploit and weaken a nation, and China's foreign policy has been defined by a determination to never again be vulnerable to such exploitation. Today, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and its growing presence in global trade networks reflect its ambition to expand its influence and reshape global economic systems. While still grappling with internal challenges such as income inequality, environmental degradation, and political repression, China's transformation over the past few decades is a testament to its resilience and determination. China has not only reclaimed its economic independence, but has also become an influential player on the world stage. The story of China's rise is one of overcoming adversity, learning from its past mistakes, and adapting to the changing world. And though the Opium Wars left a legacy of suffering and humiliation, they also provided the impetus for China's modern-day revival, a revival that continues to shape the global order today. As we reflect on China's journey from the devastation of the Opium Wars to its emergence as a global superpower, we witness a remarkable narrative of resilience, adaptation, and recovery. The tale of China's century of humiliation, one that began with the Opium Wars and extended through decades of foreign exploitation, political upheaval, and social disintegration now intertwines with a powerful story of national renewal. From the ashes of its imperial past, China has risen, and in doing so, it has reshaped not only its destiny, but the global landscape. At the heart of this transformation lies a profound psychological shift in the national consciousness. The Opium Wars were more than just military defeats or diplomatic setbacks. They represented a fundamental crisis of identity for the Chinese people. For centuries, China had seen itself as the center of civilization, a belief rooted in its immense cultural, philosophical, and technological contributions to humanity. The forceful opening of its borders to foreign traders, the loss of critical territories, and the addiction crisis catalyzed by the opium trade fractured this self-perception. China was no longer the Middle Kingdom, but rather a country subjugated by foreign powers. It was a humiliation that stretched across generations, embedding itself in the collective memory of the Chinese people. The legacy of the Opium Wars can be seen in the nationalist movements that began in earnest during the late Qing Dynasty and continued throughout the Republican era and beyond. The deep desire to regain sovereignty, to modernize in the face of Western industrial prowess, and to restore China's rightful place in the world order was fueled by a longing for the self-respect that had been stripped away by foreign domination. This nationalist fervor led to the rise of influential reformers, intellectuals, and revolutionaries who increasingly recognized that China's survival depended not only on political stability but on economic modernization and social renewal. The end of imperial rule in 1911 and the founding of the Republic of China symbolized a new chapter, though not without its own set of challenges. The collapse of the Qing Dynasty did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. In fact, China's problems only deepened. The nationalist government struggled to unify the country, plagued by warlord factions, foreign pressures, and internal discord. And while the rise of Chinese communism would eventually bring the country together under the People's Republic of China in 1949, this new chapter was no less tumultuous. Mao Zedong's policies, including the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, took a heavy toll on the nation, exacerbating China's challenges and slowing the pace of meaningful reform. However, from these struggles emerged a powerful resilience. The political and economic policies initiated by Deng Xiaoping after the death of Mao in the late 1972 marked a profound turning point for China. The reform and opening up policy began the process of economic liberalization, market-driven reforms, and integration into the global economy. In the span of just a few decades, China was transformed from a nation struggling with poverty, political isolation, and social instability into one of the world's most dynamic and powerful economic forces. At the core of China's rise has been the integration of market mechanisms into an otherwise socialist economy. Deng's idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics allowed China to capitalize on the benefits of global trade and foreign investment while maintaining state control over key sectors. The establishment of special economic zones, SEZs, and the liberalization of certain industries were pivotal to the country's success. This marked the beginning of an era where China could leverage its vast labor force and growing infrastructure to become the manufacturing hub of the world. Cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Guangzhou rapidly transformed from rural backwaters into bustling, world-class centers of commerce and innovation. However, China's economic transformation was not without its challenges. As the country grew, so too did its social and economic inequalities. The rapid pace of urbanization created stark divisions between the coastal cities, which were becoming global centers of finance and technology, and the rural heartlands, where millions of people continued to live in poverty. The shift toward a more market-oriented economy also led to environmental degradation, with unchecked industrial growth contributing to air and water pollution soil erosion, and deforestation. Despite these challenges, China's economic expansion continued at a breakneck pace, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and establishing the country as the second largest economy in the world. China's rise has also had profound geopolitical implications. The country, which once stood divided and under the control of foreign powers, has emerged as a global superpower in its own right. China's increasing military strength, coupled with its economic power, has made it a major player in international diplomacy, trade, and security. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, exemplifies China's ambition to reshape global trade routes and influence economies across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Through strategic infrastructure projects, China is effectively building a new global economic Silk Road that will connect China to key markets and bolster its influence in the international arena. The shadow of the Opium Wars looms large in China's foreign policy. The country's determination to protect its sovereignty and economic interests is rooted in the memory of past humiliations. This historical consciousness has shaped China's engagement with the world, leading to a foreign policy based on non-interference, self-reliance, and the pursuit of national dignity. China's rise has been framed as a moral and political imperative to reclaim its place on the global stage, no longer as a victim of imperialism, but as an equal player in the global order. The legacy of the Opium Wars also plays a role in China's relationship with the West. For many Chinese, the wars represent the darkest chapter in their modern history, one that demonstrates the vulnerability of nations when they fail to adapt to the changing tides of global power. As China grows in influence, it has become increasingly assertive in defending its national interests, whether it's over the status of Taiwan, the control of Hong Kong, or its claims in the South China Sea. At the same time, China's economic clout has allowed it to challenge traditional power structures and reframe the narrative of global development. The rise of China as an economic and political force is not simply a consequence of its internal reforms, but also a product of the global shifts triggered by its historical struggle for sovereignty and respect. Today, as China looks to the future, the legacy of the Opium Wars is not one of lingering weakness, but of strength born from adversity. The centuries-long journey from imperial glory to imperial subjugation and back again has produced a China that is fiercely protective of its sovereignty, determined to shape its own destiny, and unwilling to allow any external force to dictate its future. The Opium Wars, in their devastating consequences, led to an era of profound national reckoning, but also sparked the transformation of China into a modern and influential state. The story of China's recovery, its economic rise, its social transformation, and its growing global influence continues to unfold. China's role in the 21st century is not just a story of recovery from past humiliations, but also a powerful narrative of reassertion, self-determination, and global leadership. As China navigates its complex relationship with the rest of the world, it does so from a position of strength, having overcome the legacy of the Opium Wars and risen to become a central player on the global stage. Yet, as the world's largest population, a leading economic power, and an increasingly influential military force, China's journey remains one of continuing adaptation, ever mindful of its past lessons but ever more determined to secure its future. In the decades to come, China's rise will likely be one of the defining narratives of the global era, a story of how a great empire, once brought to its knees by the force of foreign power and exploitation, has not only survived, but has thrived as a vibrant, powerful, and ever-evolving nation. The Opium Wars and their aftermath may have shaped China's path, but they did not determine its destiny. The future of China will be a testament to the resilience of its people, the strength of its culture, and the enduring power of its national pride. As we look ahead, it is clear that China's transformation is far from complete. But one thing is certain: the world will never again view China as it once did. From the ashes of its century of humiliation, China has risen, and its place in the future of global affairs is secure. The echoes of the Opium Wars will always be part of China's history, but they have long since ceased to define it. Instead, China now stands as a beacon of strength, self-determination, and the incredible potential of a nation that has refused to be defined by its past mistakes and instead has created a future full of promise.